On the 6th of November, 1942, a battalion of United States Marines walked into the jungle on Guadalcanal and disappeared. The Japanese knew they were in there. They posted rear guards. They set ambushes on the trails behind them. They sent out patrols to find the American column and destroy it. 29 days later, the Marines walked out. 488 Japanese soldiers were dead. The Marines had lost 16. Every rear guard sent to find them had been annihilated. This is the story of that patrol and of the officer who led it, a man his own Marine Corps did not trust. There is a sound that men who fought on Guadalcanal never forgot. It came at night, always at night. First the distant thump far off, muffled by miles of jungle. Then a few seconds of nothing long enough for a man lying in a foxhole full of rainwater to hear his own heartbeat. Then the shell. The Americans gave it a name, because naming a thing is the only power you have over something you cannot kill. They called it Pistol Pete. It was not one gun. It was a network of them, Japanese 150mm howitzers and 100mm cannon, dragged piece by piece through the rainforest by men who had not eaten properly in weeks, and placed in the folds and ravines of the high ground west of the perimeter, beyond the Guadalcanal River. From those positions, the guns could reach Henderson Field. They fired at dusk. They fired at midnight. They fired. Exhaustion had finally taken a man under, and the point of the shelling was not accuracy. It was that no one would ever sleep. By late October 1942, the Guadalcanal campaign was 5 months old and bleeding out. The Americans held one thing on that island. One runway, Henderson Field, a strip of crushed coral and steel matting laid over ground that turned to soup in the rain, ringed by a perimeter so thin that in places a man could walk from the front line to the beach in 20 minutes. Everything else on Guadalcanal belonged to the jungle, and the jungle increasingly belonged to the Japanese. The Marines who held that perimeter were not the men who had landed in August. Not physically. Malaria had gone through the division like fire through dry grass. Dysentery had followed. Men had lost 20-30 pounds. Their uniforms had rotted off them in strips. There was a condition the corpsmen called jungle rot, a tropical infection that ate into the skin of the legs and feet, opening sores that would not close because nothing on that island was ever dry. Rations were short. For weeks in September, the garrison had eaten captured Japanese rice, and at night the ships came. Japanese cruisers and destroyers ran down the channel the Americans had already started calling Iron Bottom Sound because of what was lying on the floor of it, and they shelled the airfield from the water. By day, the bombers came from Rabaul, high and unhurried, and the Marines watched the bomb bays open from the bottom of their holes, and there was nothing to do but press your face into the mud and wait to find out. That was the situation. One airstrip, a perimeter held by men who were sick more often than they were well, and an enemy who had decided, at the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Army, that Guadalcanal was where the American advance would be stopped. On the night of October 23rd, 1942, the Japanese made their maximum effort. Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, commanding the 2nd Infantry Division, one of the most storied divisions in the Japanese Army, the division that had taken Java, threw the weight of his command at the southern face of the Marine perimeter. His men had spent days cutting a trail through the interior of the island, a track so narrow and so steep that they had abandoned most of their artillery along the way. They arrived hungry, they arrived late, and then they attacked. The assault came in waves, in the rain, in the dark, against wire and interlocking machine gun fire and pre-registered artillery. It came on the 23rd, and again on the 24th, and again on the 25th. Japanese soldiers went into the wire and died in the wire, and the men behind them climbed over the bodies and went into the wire too. It lasted 3 days. When it was over, the Marines went out to count. This was a grim clerical exercise that armies perform after such things, and the men detailed to it walked the ground in front of their own positions with notebooks, counting the dead in the grass and the mud and hanging on the wire itself. The tally came to 1,462. Maruyama's offensive had failed completely. What was left of the 2nd Division began dragging itself west toward the Guadalcanal River, toward the main Japanese positions. Some of those men would never get there. But there was another force on Guadalcanal that had not been at Henderson Field that night. And it is that force, not Maruyama's, that this story is about. Colonel Toshinari Shoji commanded the 230th Infantry Regiment of the Japanese 38th Division. Somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men. His orders had sent him east, away from the main effort, toward a place on the northern coast called Coley Point. He was to establish a position there and wait. Destroyers would come. Reinforcements would land. From Coley Point, a second front would open against the American perimeter from the opposite side. That was the plan. The plan did not survive the last week of October. With Maruyama's offensive broken, Shoji's regiment was no longer one arm of a coordinated pincer. It was a large body of armed men, sitting alone on a beach on the wrong side of the American perimeter, with the entire weight of the 1st Marine Division now free to turn in its direction. The Americans saw the opportunity immediately. Between November 3rd and November 12th, they moved to close a ring around Coley Point. 2 Marine battalions from the west, 2 Army battalions from the east, from the 164th Infantry Regiment National Guardsmen from North Dakota, who had already proved themselves during the October fighting. The Jaws would meet at a place called Gavaga Creek, and Shoji's regiment would cease to exist. It was a good plan. It was executed through terrain that made a mockery of good plans: swamp, flooded creek beds, mangrove, rain that turned every approach march into a crawl. The battalions moved slower than the map said they should, and the ring closed more slowly than anyone intended. And there remained, for several critical days, a gap in the southern face of the cordon. Shoji found it. Between November 9th and November 11th, Colonel Shoji led the bulk of his regiment out through that gap and south, into the trackless interior of Guadalcanal. Not toward the sea, not toward rescue, into the mountains, into a green wilderness that no army had ever crossed and that no map of the period accurately described. The encirclement closed on an empty position. This is the first turn in the story, and it is worth sitting with because everything that follows comes out of it. The Americans had not won at Coley Point. They had shifted a problem. Somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 Japanese soldiers, organized, armed, still under command, still carrying their machine guns, and at least 2 mountain guns had disappeared into the center of the island. They were behind the American lines now. They were moving west, toward the Matanikau, toward the main Japanese army. And the route they were taking ran through the high ground where Pistol Pete lived. Someone had to go after them. The problem was that nobody in the American command had a unit designed to do it. The Marine Rifle battalions on Guadalcanal were built to hold ground and to attack across ground. They were tied to supply. They moved with mortars and heavy machine guns and belted ammunition, and they did not go 100 miles into a rainforest with no roads and no depots, and no medical evacuation, and no way to be reinforced if things went wrong. There was, however, one battalion on that island built around a different idea entirely. And to understand it, you have to understand the man who built it, because the two things are inseparable, and because he was, by almost any measure, the strangest officer in the United States Marine Corps. Evans Carlson was 46 years old in November of 1942. He was tall and thin to the point of gauntness, with a long, weathered face and deep-set eyes. And he had the manner of a man who was always slightly somewhere else, a congregational minister's son, who read philosophy and wrote long letters, and had spent most of his adult life outside the country of his birth. He had lied about his age to enlist in the United States Army at 16. He served in the Philippines and in Hawaii, earned a commission during the First World War, and served in France with the American Expeditionary Force. He was a captain at 22. And then he did something almost no one does. He left. He tried civilian life, sold produce for a time, found it unbearable, and in 1922, he walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office and enlisted as a private. Not as a former captain seeking an equivalent commission. As a private. He wanted to start over from the bottom in a service he had decided was better than the one he had left. He earned his way back up, and in 1930, in Nicaragua, leading a patrol of 12 Marines against a force of roughly 40 armed bandits at a place called Portillo, he earned the first of his 3 Navy Crosses. Then came China. Carlson served 3 tours in China between 1927 and 1938. The first 2 were conventional enough legation duty, Shanghai, the world of the treaty ports. It was the third that changed everything. By 1937, Japan had invaded China outright, and Carlson, now a captain and an official observer for the United States, went into the field to watch that war. He could have watched it from Nanking or Hankow, from a hotel balcony filing reports. Instead, he attached himself to a Chinese communist formation, the 8th Route Army, commanded by Zhu De, and went with them behind the Japanese lines in northern China. He stayed for the better part of a year. He walked, by his own account, thousands of miles. He slept in villages and in fields. He ate what the soldiers ate. He met Zhou Enlai. And he watched day after day, month after month, how a force with no air support, no artillery worth the name, and rifles that were often older than the men carrying them, systematically tore apart a modern imperial army. They did it by never standing still. They did it by attacking where the enemy was weakest and vanishing before the counterpunch landed. They did it by treating the civilian population as an asset rather than an obstacle, by paying for food, by not looting, by building an intelligence network out of ordinary farmers who would tell them exactly where the Japanese garrison was and how many men it had. They did it through what Carlson came to describe as ethical indoctrination, the conviction that a soldier who understands why he is fighting will outfight a soldier who is merely ordered to. He came home with two things. The first was a phrase. He had heard it among the Chinese cooperatives Gong He, an abbreviation of a longer term meaning to work together in harmony. Carlson anglicized it into two syllables that would end up in the American dictionary and stay there for 80 years. Gung Ho. The second was a tactical concept, and it was worth considerably more than the phrase. But before he could use either of them, Carlson did something that nearly ended his career. In 1939, he resigned his commission, resigned it outright, because as a serving officer, he was not permitted to speak publicly about what he had seen. He wanted to warn Americans about Japan. He wanted to argue for an embargo on the war materials that were flowing across the Pacific into Japanese factories. So he took off the uniform in order to say it. He wrote books. He gave lectures. He was, in the political vocabulary of the late 1930s, an inconvenient man. And the fact that his admiration for the Eighth Route Army's methods was tactical rather than ideological was a distinction that a great many senior officers either could not or would not make. Then Japan did what he had said Japan would do, and in April of 1941, the Marine Corps took him back. The 2nd Marine Raider Battalion was activated in February 1942, and Carlson was given command. He built it from nothing, and he built it wrong by every convention of the United States Marine Corps, and right by everything he had learned in China. Start with the squad, because that is where the revolution was. A standard Marine rifle squad in early 1942 was 8 men built around a single Browning automatic rifle. It was a formation inherited from the First World War, and it had a specific weakness. It was one thing. It moved as one thing, fired as one thing, and if it was pinned, all of it was pinned. Carlson tore it up. His squad was 10 men, a squad leader, and 3 fire teams of 3. Each team was built around 3 weapons doing 3 different jobs: a rifle, a submachine gun, and a Browning automatic rifle. Semi-automatic reach, close-range volume, sustained automatic fire, in one 3-man package. Semi-automatic accuracy, close-range volume, and sustained automatic fire in a package small enough to be controlled by one man's voice and mobile enough to move through jungle in single file. 3 of these to a squad, 3 independent maneuver elements where there had been 1. The arithmetic of it is the part that matters. A Japanese rifle squad of comparable size was built around bolt-action Arisakas and a single light machine gun, 1 automatic weapon. A Carlson squad carried 6. At 30 yards, out of vegetation you cannot see into. That difference will break a formation 3 times your size before it is decided which way to face. That 3-man fire team is now the fundamental building block of every Marine rifle squad on Earth. It has outlived the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, and everything after. Evans Carlson built it in 1942 in a training camp in California, on the basis of what he had watched Chinese guerrillas do in Shanxi province. But he did not stop at tactics, and this is where the Marine Corps establishment stopped following him. In the 2nd Raider Battalion, officers ate last. Every man in the chow line, private, corporal, sergeant went through before the officers did. There were no separate messes. There were no privileges of rank in the field. Carlson held meetings. He called them gung-ho sessions, and at them any Marine of any rank could stand up and speak, could question an order, could argue with a captain, could tell the battalion commander to his face that he thought a decision was wrong. Carlson explained the strategic situation to privates. He told them why the Pacific mattered, why Japan had gone to war, what was at stake in the specific patch of jungle they were about to enter. The Marine Corps establishment found this intolerable. Some senior officers said in plain language that they believed Carlson was a communist sympathizer, and they did not always say it behind his back. Carlson did not appear to care. 3,000 volunteers applied for his battalion. He took roughly 1,000. He interviewed men personally, and he had a question. He asked in those interviews a question that tells you more about what he was building than any doctrine paper ever could. Could you cut a man's throat without warning? That was the battalion. Egalitarian, argumentative, ideologically motivated, and trained to a standard of physical hardness that bordered on cruelty, men who could march 50 miles in a day and who had been taught that hunger and rain and exhaustion were conditions of employment rather than emergencies. They had been in combat once before Guadalcanal, and it had not gone the way the newsreel said. On the 17th and 18th of August, 1942, two companies of the 2nd Raider Battalion, about 211 men, Carlson among them, had raided the Japanese garrison on Makan Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. They had been delivered by two submarines, the Nautilus and the Argonaut, riding for days in the fetid air of the boats, and they had gone ashore in rubber rafts through surf that swamped outboard motors and soaked weapons. The raid destroyed the garrison, and it was sold to the American public as a triumph at a moment when the American public badly needed one. The reality was messier. The landing was disorganized, radios failed, the withdrawal through the surf was a disaster, rafts flipped, men drowned or were driven back onto the beach, and the evacuation stretched across a full extra day. And when the submarines finally pulled away, 9 Marines were left behind on that atoll. They were captured. They were taken to Kwajalein. And on the 16th of October, 1942, while Carlson's battalion was preparing to sail for Guadalcanal, those 9 men were beheaded. Carlson did not know their fate in November of 1942. Nobody on the American side did. It would come out after the war. But he knew he had left 9 of his own men on a beach, and there is no evidence that he ever stopped carrying it. That was the unit. That was the man. And on the 4th of November, 1942, they arrived at the eastern end of Guadalcanal. Aola Bay, on the northeast coast, roughly 40 miles east of Henderson Field, and well outside any American perimeter. Companies C and E of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion came ashore from the destroyer transports McKean and Manly, 267 Marines. They waded in through the shallows with rifles held clear of the water, and the beach was quiet, and the jungle behind it was a green wall that gave back nothing. With them came a man who was not a Marine, and who was arguably the most valuable human being on that beach. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza was a Solomon Islander, a veteran of the British colonial constabulary, and he was roughly 50 years old. 3 months earlier, in August, he had been captured by Japanese soldiers while scouting near the American lines. They found a small American flag hidden on him. They tied him to a tree. They questioned him about the strength and position of the Marine perimeter, and when he would not answer, they bayoneted him 7 times, through the chest and the throat, and left him for dead. He was not dead. When they had gone, he chewed through the ropes binding him to the tree. Then he crawled 3 miles through jungle with 7 bayonet wounds and his throat cut to the American lines. He arrived, delivered a warning of the Japanese assault that was coming that night, and only then collapsed. He was back in the field within 2 weeks. Jacob Vuza would walk every single step of the next month alongside the raiders. He would command the scouts. He would recruit and direct the carriers. Most of what Carlson knew about where the enemy was, in the month that followed, he knew because Vuza's people told him. Now the mission. The raiders had not been sent to Aola Bay to hunt anyone. They had been sent as a security force. A naval construction battalion, Seabees, was to build a second airfield at Aola, easing the pressure on Henderson Field, and the raiders were there to stand guard while they did it. Within 24 hours, it was clear that the site was worthless. The ground at Aola Bay was swamp, not difficult ground. Not ground that would need extra effort, swamp-saturated, unstable, incapable of holding a runway, and anyone who had walked it for an hour could see as much. The entire enterprise was a mistake made on a map by men who had never stood on the place, and it would be abandoned soon after. So there it is. The most consequential Marine patrol of the Guadalcanal campaign began as a guard detail for an airfield that could never have been built. Carlson had 2 companies, no mission worth the name, and roughly 40 miles of unmapped enemy jungle between him and the nearest friendly position. And then the orders changed. At that moment, the Americans were still trying to close the ring at Coley Point, and what they needed was pressure from the east, someone to come up behind the trap and make sure nothing walked out of it. A Japanese regiment was sitting in that cordon, between 2,000 and 3,000 men. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, had almost nothing to spare. Every rifle battalion he owned was committed. What he had sitting in a swamp on the far side of the island doing nothing useful, commanded by an officer half the corps distrusted, was the 2nd Raider Battalion. New orders were sent out to Carlson by air. March overland, move west, find the Shoji detachment and cut off its line of retreat. Nobody knew yet that within a week there would be nothing left at Coley Point to trap. There would be no motor transport because there were no roads. No artillery, beyond what could be called in by radio when the patrol happened to be inside range of the guns at Lunga. No hot food, no blankets, no fixed line of communication, and no reliable evacuation for the wounded. Resupply would come forward from the coast on the backs of Solomon Islanders, in loads carried by hand on a cycle of roughly 4 days. A battalion commander with any regard for his own career could have found a dozen reasons why this was not feasible. Carlson began moving on the 6th of November. By the 10th, he had built the operation up to 5 companies. Roughly 600 raiders pushed forward from the coast to an inland base camp at a village called Binu on the Balasuna River. From Binu, patrols could reach south and west into the country Shoji had to cross. The logistics were the quiet miracle of the whole affair, and they were almost entirely Melanesian. Solomon Islands carriers men who were not soldiers, who owed the Americans nothing, and who had made a judgment about the Japanese occupation and acted on it, moved food inland from the beach on a 4-day cycle. Rice, bacon, raisins, tea. That was the diet. No field rations in the conventional sense, because field rations were heavy and the raiders were not carrying anything heavy. No blankets. Each man cooked his own food over his own small fire. Each man cut boughs from the trees to sleep on because the ground was standing water. Each man carried roughly 4 days of rations on his back and the ammunition for his own weapon, and nothing else that was not essential. The country they were entering was triple canopy rainforest. Under that canopy, the light at midday was the color of weak tea. There were vines with edges that cut skin like a blade. There were rivers to be crossed chest deep, and on Guadalcanal a river can rise 4 feet in an hour of rain, and the rain did not stop. There were volcanic ridges that had to be climbed on hands and knees. There were leeches in numbers that men described afterward in tones of disbelief. And malaria was already in the column when it left Binu. Not coming. In it. By the 10th, he had built the operation up to 5 companies. The first contact came on the evening of the 7th of November at the Rico River. Villagers had warned the scouts that Japanese soldiers were close. Carlson took a platoon across the river, personally the battalion commander, 46 years old, in the lead element in the dark, in the water. The ambush opened up at close range, muzzle flashes in the black. The lead native scout went down badly wounded. The raiders returned fire into the tree line and killed 2 Japanese soldiers, and then the shooting stopped as abruptly as it had started, and the rest of the enemy simply went away into the jungle. 2 dead. 1 friendly casualty. By the standards of what was coming, it was nothing at all, but something had been established, and both sides now understood it. There were Americans in the interior of Guadalcanal, not a coastal raid, not a reconnaissance flight, a body of armed men in the deep jungle on foot behind the Japanese line of retreat. Colonel Shoji's regiment began doing what any competent force does when it is being followed. They posted rear guards, they set ambushes on the trails behind them. They sent out patrols to find the American column and destroy it. They were hunting. They had every reason to believe they would win. They outnumbered the raiders 3 or 4 to 1. They were fighting a withdrawal through terrain they had already crossed. And the American unit behind them was small, unsupported, hundreds of men deep in a rainforest with no line of supply worth cutting, and no way out except the way it had come in. Every one of those calculations was correct. Every one of them was also irrelevant, because they were built on an assumption about what kind of unit was following them, and that assumption was wrong in a way that no one in the 230th Infantry Regiment would live long enough to correct. On the morning of the 10th of November, Solomon Islands scouts came into Binu with a report. Roughly 1,000 Japanese soldiers were moving south along the Metapona River, about 3 miles west of the Raider base camp. Carlson had spent a year of his life studying how small forces destroy large ones. He had built a battalion for exactly this and had been given command of it over the objections of men who thought he was a political liability. He had 1,000 enemy soldiers 3 miles away, 5 companies in hand, and terrain that would let him get close without being seen. He gave the order to sweep at first light. The morning was the 11th of November, 1942. Nobody on either side of the Metapona River knew it yet, but the hunt had just reversed. Carlson looked at his sketch and did the thing he had spent a year in China learning how to do. He did not plan a frontal attack. He planned a net. 4 companies would move west from Binu in a converging sweep from south to north on separate axes, spread across a front wide enough that whatever was out there could not slip between them. 1 company would hold at Binu as reserve. The companies would move independently, out of sight of one another, in country where a man could not see 50 feet, coordinated only by radio and by the direction of the sound of firing. It was on paper an extremely dangerous way to attack a superior force. Any one of those companies could be isolated and destroyed before the others knew it was in trouble. Carlson accepted that risk deliberately. He had watched Chinese guerrillas do exactly this against the Japanese army in Shanxi, and he had watched it work. And the reason it worked was that a dispersed force is not a target. It is a set of problems arriving from different directions at the same time. At dawn, the companies went out. The morning of November 11th was gray and close and already hot. Under triple canopy, the light was the color of weak tea, and everything a man touched was wet. The raiders moved in file, weapons at the ready, the scouts out ahead, Vuza's people, barefoot, silent, reading ground that the Americans could not read at all. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, the lead company on the northern axis came out of the tree line into open ground. It was a kunai grass clearing. Kunai is a coarse tropical grass that on Guadalcanal grew to the height of a man's chest, sometimes higher. Standing in it, you cannot see the ground. You cannot see the man 10 feet to your left. You can only see the wall of it in front of your face and the tree line at the far side, shimmering in the heat. There is no cover in kunai grass. There is only concealment. And concealment ends the moment somebody knows where you are. The point squad went into the open first. They had covered a portion of the clearing when the tree line ahead of them came apart. Rifles first, the flat, hard crack of Arisakas. Then the machine guns, the Japanese Type 92s with their slow, deliberate hammering. Then mortars dropping into the grass among men who had nowhere on God's earth to go. This was not a patrol. This was a rearguard battalion of the 230th Infantry Regiment, dug in along the far edge of the clearing in prepared positions, with fields of fire laid across the open ground. They were covering Shoji's main body while it crossed the Metapona behind them, and they had been waiting. The raiders in that grass were being fired on by an enemy they could not see, from a position they had not located, in a field with no cover, and their casualties came in the first 90 seconds. 7 Marines were killed at the point of contact. 7 men, in the first minutes, in waist-high grass in the open with no depression in the ground to roll into and no log to get behind, listening to rounds cut the stalks over their heads at the height of a man's chest. The point squad was destroyed as a fighting element. The company behind it went flat and stayed flat, pinned, unable to advance and unable to withdraw across open ground under observed machine gun fire. Here is the thing to understand about that moment. Everything that Evans Carlson believed, the dispersion, the independent companies, the willingness to send small units into unmapped jungle without mutual support, had just produced exactly the outcome his critics in the Marine Corps had warned about. An isolated company, pinned, alone, taking casualties in contact with a force several times its size. The long patrol very nearly ended on its first real day. Word went back to Binu by radio. Carlson's response took less time than it takes to describe. He did not order the pinned company to break contact and pull back. He did not consolidate. He did not wait for a clearer picture. He ordered the enemy fixed, and then he went for both flanks. One company was sent against the Japanese left. Another was ordered to swing wide a long looping march north and then west, out of contact around the entire enemy position through the village of Asamana, to come in behind the Japanese at the river crossing itself. That second order was the decision the whole month turned on. It required a company to march away from the sound of the guns, out of supporting distance into unreconnoitered ground, on the assumption that it would arrive somewhere useful at some unknown time. If it got lost, the pinned company might not survive the afternoon. One of the 2 flanking companies did get lost. It happened almost immediately. Moving through dense jungle under fire, the company commander became separated from his own unit. The company went one way. He went another. And when he finally emerged hours later, but back at the base camp, at Binu with 9 men. 9. A Marine rifle company on Guadalcanal in November 1942 might muster 130 men, sometimes fewer. He had 9, and he had no idea where the rest of them were, and the battle was still going on 3 miles to the west. The rest of that company was not destroyed. It was leaderless in a firefight, which in that terrain amounts to the same thing for as long as it lasts. Carlson relieved him of command that night. Sit with that for a moment, because it tells you something important about the man that the gung-ho meetings and the officers' eat-last business can obscure. Evans Carlson has come down to us as the egalitarian, the officer who let privates argue with captains, the man who explained the war to his riflemen. All of that is true. But he was also running a battalion of 600 men 100 miles inside enemy country, with no reinforced and no line of retreat. And on the first day of serious fighting, he took a company commander's command away from him before the sun came up again. There was no board of inquiry. There was no appeal. There was a battalion commander standing in the rain at Benue who had just watched 7 of his men die in a grass field, and there was a decision, and it was final. That is the man who was leading this patrol. The other flanking company did not get lost. It marched through jungle, around the northern flank of the Japanese line, and into the village of Asamana, a scatter of huts on the east bank of the Metapona River, empty of enemy, and utterly unknown to the Japanese battalion, fighting 3/4 of a mile to the south. The raiders came through the village and out onto the riverbank, and there, in front of them, in broad daylight, was the main body of Colonel Shoji's detachment fording the Metapona. They were in the water, knee-deep and thigh-deep, strung out across the current in a long file, rifles held up over their heads with both hands to keep them dry. A man crossing a river with his weapon above his head cannot shoot. He cannot go to ground because there is no ground. He cannot run because the water holds him. He cannot take cover because a river has no cover in it anywhere. The raiders set up their light machine guns on the bank. What followed is the reason the engagement at Asamana is still studied. The guns opened at close range across open water. The Japanese in the river were hit while they were still in the river. Those on the near bank were caught in the open ground of the crossing site. Those who had already reached the far side turned and began firing back into the village, and for the next several hours the fight went back and forth along that riverbank in a way that no clean account can really capture. At one point the two sides closed to within 30 paces. 30 paces, that is the distance across a suburban street. At that range, the Thompson submachine guns in the Raider fire teams were worth more than any rifle in the Japanese army, and the Browning automatic rifles were worth more still. The Raider company ran low on ammunition. It pulled back through the village to redistribute what was left, and then it counterattacked and took the bank again. One Marine, who was there a private first class named Jesse Van Landingham, described the shooting on the river afterward in 6 words that have followed the battle ever since. It was like shooting birds. He was not boasting. Men who have been in that kind of one-sided killing very rarely boast about it. He was reaching for the only comparison he had for something that did not resemble combat as he understood it. By mid-afternoon, Carlson had brought his reserve company forward from Benue, and he had done something else. He got on the radio to Henderson Field. 2 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Henderson Field came out over the Metapona that afternoon and put their ordnance onto the remaining Japanese concentration. It is a detail worth pausing on. A Marine battalion on foot, deep in the interior of Guadalcanal, out of contact with any friendly ground unit, calling down dive bombers on a target its own scouts had found. When the firing stopped, the ground around that river crossing and the kunai field to the south held 160 Japanese dead. The raiders had lost 10 men killed and 13 wounded. Those numbers are not rounded for effect, and they are not estimates made afterward by men with an interest in the answer. They were counted. And now the part of this story that most accounts leave out, because it does not fit the shape people want a story like this to have. On the morning of the 12th of November, the raiders went back over the kunai field where the point squad had been destroyed the previous day to recover their dead. They found the body of a private named Owen Barber. He had been staked to the ground. He had been mutilated. What had been done to him is described in the accounts in language deliberately kept short, and there is no reason to be more specific here than the record is. Evans Carlson had spent a year of his life among Chinese communist troops studying, among other things, a doctrine of humane treatment of prisoners, the idea that an enemy soldier well treated is worth more than an enemy soldier killed because he goes back and tells others. He believed it, he had written about it, he had carried it across the Pacific with him, and he had tried to apply it in the field. There were 2 Japanese prisoners being held at Benue. According to the accounts left by Raider officers who were there, they were executed, with Carlson's consent, on the 12th of November, 1942. That is what those accounts say, and the record is not comfortable, and it should not be made comfortable. A commanding officer of the United States Marine Corps, who believed in the humane treatment of prisoners as a matter of considered doctrine, abandoned that doctrine within 24 hours of seeing what had been done to one of his men. You may judge that however you judge it. Men who were not standing in that field on that morning have been judging it for 80 years. What cannot be argued is that it happened and that it marks the exact point where the character of this operation changed. Up to the 11th of November, the raiders had been pursuing a retreating enemy. From the 12th of November, they stopped pursuing. They set a trap and waited for the enemy to come to them. Asamana was the trap. Consider the position from the Japanese side, because this is where the whole thing becomes almost unbearable to watch. Colonel Shoji's regiment was strung out across many miles of jungle, moving west in separate battalion-sized elements, with the primitive communications of an army that had abandoned most of its heavy equipment. Its units talked to each other by runner. Individual soldiers and small parties moved between elements carrying messages, orders, and supplies, and they navigated by the trail network and by the known locations of their own units. Asamana was one of those known locations. It was a village on a river crossing on the line of march. It was, as far as every Japanese soldier in that jungle understood, in Japanese hands. It was not in Japanese hands. It had changed ownership on the afternoon of the 11th of November, and nobody on the Japanese side knew. Carlson kept his men there and told them to stay out of sight. On the 12th of November, Japanese soldiers began walking into Asamana, one at a time, two at a time. Stragglers, small parties, coming down the trail into the village, slung, expecting to find their own people. 25 of them were killed over the course of that day. Not one raider was hit. Read that again, slowly, because the arithmetic of it is the entire story of the long patrol compressed into a single day. 25 friendly casualties, not a battle, not even, in any honest sense, a fight, and it did not stop on the 12th. On the 13th of November, Carlson's observers spotted Japanese units moving through the jungle around the village, and he reached for the radio again. Carlson had artillery support on call 75mm pack howitzers of the 1st Battalion, 10th Marines. He called for fire on 5 separate Japanese groups over the course of that day and the next. The shells came down, and after each barrage, Raider patrols went forward into the shattered ground and finished it. 116 Japanese soldiers killed across 5 engagements in 48 hours. 0 Raider casualties. You would think that somewhere in the chain of command of the 230th Infantry Regiment, someone would have understood what was happening. That messages were not arriving, that patrols sent east did not come back, that every party dispatched toward the Metapona crossing simply ceased to exist. If anyone did work it out, it was already too late to matter, and there is no evidence in the record that anyone did. This is the point in the story where it is worth stopping and asking a plain question, because the numbers coming out of that jungle stopped making sense several paragraphs ago. How? How does a battalion of 600 men, sick, unsupplied, walking with no artillery of its own and no armor and no fixed position, inflict casualties at a rate like that on a regiment 3 to 5 times its size? The answer is not courage. Courage was not in short supply on either side of that river, and anyone who tells you the Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal lacked it is telling you something false. Men of the 230th Infantry went into that jungle already half-starved, and they kept marching, and they kept fighting for weeks after any reasonable force would have quit. The answer is the 3-man fire team. Go back to the squad Carlson built. 10 men, a squad leader and 3 teams of 3, and in each team 1 M1 Garand, 1 Tom's submachine gun, 1 Browning automatic rifle. Now put that squad into jungle at 30 yards against a Japanese squad of roughly the same size, built around bolt-action rifles and 1 light machine gun. The Japanese squad has 1 light machine gun, a Type 96 or Type 99, and 8 or 9 bolt-action rifles. The Raider squad has 6 automatic weapons, 3 Thompsons and 3 BRs, plus 3 semi-automatic rifles that fire as fast as a man can pull the trigger. 6 automatic weapons against 1 at a range where accuracy stops mattering and volume is everything. That is the whole trick. There is nothing else to it. And here is the second-order effect, and it is the one that actually killed the 230th Infantry Regiment. No Japanese officer on the receiving end of that believed he was being engaged by 10 men. He could not see through the vegetation. All he had was volume of fire, and the volume of fire told him he was in contact with a company. So he did what a competent officer does when he thinks he has run into a company. He deployed, he maneuvered. He committed his reserve. He turned his march column into a battle line, a process that takes 20 or 30 minutes in open country and considerably longer in rainforest. And by the time he had done it, the 10 men were gone. They had fired for 15 or 20 seconds, killed everything in the open, and walked away into the green. Then they did it again, 400 yards down the trail, an hour later. Move fast, hit hard, disappear. That is the sentence Carlson brought back from Shanxi province. And that is what it looks like when it is applied against a regiment trying to cross 100 miles of jungle on empty stomachs. The 230th Infantry Regiment was not being defeated in battle. It was being disassembled in pieces of 20 and 30 men at a time, over weeks, by an enemy it could not find, could not fix, could not outrun, and could not accurately count. Colonel Shoji had left Coley Point with somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men. The sources vary, and the range matters more than the number. By the time his column crossed the upper Lunga River, it was down to roughly 1,300. Every rearguard he posted to screen his withdrawal walked into a kill zone. Every messenger patrol vanished, every supply party disappeared, and with every one of those small annihilations, the men still marching west knew a little less about where their own units were, and had a little less food, and were a little more alone. There is a particular horror in that kind of attrition that a set battle does not have. In a battle, you know you have been beaten. In this, there was only the slow accumulation of men who went out and did not come back. By the 17th of November, Shoji's main body had pushed deep inland, driving west toward the Matanakau River and the main lines of the Japanese 17th Army. Carlson shadowed them, and then a new set of orders came out from Vandegrift, and the mission changed for the second time. Find the supply trails behind Mount Austin. Locate the Pistol Pete artillery positions that were still dropping shells onto Henderson Field around the clock. Clear the watershed of the Upper Tenero and the Upper Lunga. In other words, stop hunting the regiment and start taking apart the country the regiment lived in. This is the moment the long patrol stopped being a pursuit and became something considerably harder. Pursuit has direction. It has an object. You follow the enemy and eventually you catch him or he gets away. What Carlson was now being asked to do was to go up into the volcanic highlands in the center of Guadalcanal, the wettest, steepest, least mapped ground on the island, and stay there indefinitely looking for things that were hidden. The patrol turned inland and began to climb. And now the enemy changed too, and this is the part of the story that the kill ratios do not show you. The rain in the highlands of Guadalcanal in November of 1942 was effectively continuous, not showers. Rain hour after hour, day after day, so that nothing ever dried, not a uniform, not a blanket that nobody had anyway, not a man's skin, not the boughs he cut to sleep on. Every man in that column had open sores on his legs. That was not an exaggeration or a figure of speech. It came from the river crossings, dozens of them, chest deep, in water, carrying whatever the jungle put into it, and from the constant abrasion of wet cloth on wet skin, and from the leeches and from the kunai grass that cut like a razor and left cuts that never closed. The corpsmen called the result jungle rot. It ate into the flesh of the feet and the ankles and the shins, and once it started in that climate, nothing available in a Marine's pack would stop it. The corpsmen were running out of medication, all of it. They were running out of everything, and through all of it, malaria was moving through the battalion. Malaria on Guadalcanal was not an illness that men shrugged off. It came with fevers over 104 degrees, with rigors that shook a grown man's body so hard he could not hold a canteen, with vomiting and with a weakness so total that walking became impossible for hours or days at a time. A man who had it in October had it again in November. Over the course of the long patrol, 225 Marines were evacuated out of that jungle, carried, walked, and led out by the Solomon Islanders, and by their own comrades for malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot. 225 against 16 killed by the enemy. For every one man the Japanese army killed on that patrol, 14 were taken out of the fight by the island itself. And the two companies that had waited ashore at Aola Bay on the 4th of November, the 267 men who had been in the jungle longest since the very first day, were, by the beginning of December, reduced to 57 men between them. 57 out of 267. They had not been shot to pieces. They had been dissolved. The men still walking were something that would have been hard to recognize as a United States Marine battalion. They were gaunt to the point of skeletal. Their uniforms had rotted. Their faces were hollowed out and yellowed from Atabrin, the anti-malarial they took when they had it. They were covered in sores. Most of them were running fevers. They had been sleeping on cut branches in standing water for a month and eating rice and bacon and raisins. And they had crossed something on the order of 150 miles of the worst country in the Pacific. They were also, at that exact moment, more dangerous than they had been on the day they landed, because the ones who were left were the ones the island had not been able to take, and they'd spent a month getting extremely good at a very specific kind of work. One of them, a private in B Company named Ben Carson, who carried a Browning automatic rifle through the entire operation, put it plainly years afterward. They were stumbling into small, separated groups of Japanese constantly, he said. They were wiping them out with flanking operations all the time. All the time. That is the texture of the last 2 weeks of the long patrol. Not battles, not engagements with names. Just contact and a flanking movement, and silence, and then walking again. The raiders lost men in those nameless fights too. Not many, one here, one there, in places that never got a name on any map. They are part of the 16. By the last week of November, the raiders were in the upper Lunga Valley, deep in the highlands, working along the ridges between the Tanaru and Lunga watersheds, looking for the trails that fed Pistol Pete. The rain had not stopped. The column was down to a fraction of its strength. The men were sick. The medicine was gone. And somewhere below them, in the folds of that green country, 100 Japanese soldiers were resting in a hidden camp with their rifles stacked in the center of it, out of arm's reach, because they were certain that no American would ever find them there. On the 30th of November, a 6-man squad following a telephone wire along a ridge in the pouring rain was about to find them. 6 men from F Company were on that ridge. 6. Their squad leader was a corporal named John Yancey, and Yancey was Evans Carlson's personal bodyguard, which tells you something about him before he does anything at all. He was 24 years old. He was from Arkansas. In civilian life, he had run a liquor store, and he would go back to running one. And the gap between that fact and what he did on this ridge is a gap that this story is never going to close, because it does not close. They found the wire. They followed it. A telephone line means a headquarters at one end of it. It also means somebody has to walk that line to repair it, which means there is a path, and there was a trail so faint it was less a trail than a suggestion, dropping downhill off the ridge into the deep green. They went down it. At the bottom, the ground flattened out into a hollow, and in that hollow was a Japanese bivouac. Roughly 100 men. They were resting, improvised shelters under the canopy, cooking fires, soldiers sitting and lying in the wet in the middle of the afternoon, in a place where they had every reason to believe no American had ever set foot. And in the center of the camp, neatly stacked against the trees in the way that soldiers of every army in history have stacked them, were their rifles. Out of arm's reach, all of them. 6 men were standing at the edge of that hollow looking down at 100. Yancey had 3 Browning automatic rifles and 2 Thompson submachine guns in his squad. He had 100 enemy soldiers in front of him and no support within sound of a shout, and the entire body of accumulated military wisdom on earth said one thing, and it said it very loudly. Go back. Report the position. Bring up the company. That is the correct answer. It is the answer that would appear on any examination at any staff college in the world, and it would be marked correct, and it would be correct. Yancey did not do it. He did not radio. He did not withdraw. There is no indication in any account that he stood there weighing it for more than the few seconds it took to see the stacked rifles and understand what they meant. He walked into the camp firing his Thompson from the hip. His 5 Marines came with him. What happened in that hollow lasted 30 minutes, and it was not a battle in any sense that the word usually carries. 3 Browning automatic rifles at a range measured in feet cutting through canvas shelters and the men inside them. Thompsons at conversational distance. Japanese soldiers coming up off the ground and running for the stacks in the center of the camp, and most of them never getting there. Because the distance between a man lying down and a rifle leaning on a tree 40 feet away is a distance that takes 4 seconds to cross, and 4 seconds was more than anyone in that hollow had. The rain was coming down hard enough that the smoke hung in it. The raiders could not always see each other. They used a call sign to keep from shooting their own 2 words, shouted through the downpour and the muzzle flashes. Hi, Raider. That was it. That was the whole system. 6 men in a camp of 100 calling to each other by voice because there was no other way to know. Somewhere nearby, another Raider officer heard the eruption of automatic fire, a sound that, in that valley at that moment, could only mean a squad had walked into something it could not survive and shouted through the jungle to find out what was happening. Yancey's answer came back over the noise of it. I flushed a covey. Send up a squad, a covey. The word a bird hunter uses. 30 minutes. When it was over, 75 Japanese soldiers were dead in that hollow. Not one of the 6 Marines had been killed. Carlson, who had been in the Marine Corps in one form or another since 1922, who had fought bandits in Nicaragua and walked behind the lines in China and watched his men take Mackinac Atoll, called it the most spectacular of any of their engagements. His own Navy Cross citation for the long patrol would summarize the whole month in the flattened language that such documents always use: the heavy toll of the enemy, the small losses to our own men. Those words are accurate and they are also useless. Nothing written on a citation has ever conveyed 6 men going down a trail in the rain into 100. Yancey received the Navy Cross for it, and a battlefield commission to first lieutenant. A corporal running a liquor store 2 years earlier became an officer of Marines on the strength of what he did in that hollow. And 8 years later, on a frozen hill in North Korea called 1282, above the Chosin Reservoir, serving with the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. In a night of fighting that killed most of the men around him, he earned a second one. Some men carry something that the mathematics of combat cannot explain. There is no doctrine that produces John Yancey. There is no training program. He was simply a particular kind of human being, and the century he was born into found a use for him twice. And they had one more thing to do, Mount Austin. That was the high ground behind Henderson Field. It was the ground that overlooked everything, the airfield, the perimeter, the whole coastal plain. Whoever held it could see the Americans breathe. Vandegrift wanted the trails behind it found, the terrain mapped, the watershed cleared. Within weeks, American troops would be fighting for that mountain, and they would go up it on the information Carlson was about to bring back. On the 3rd of December, in steady rain, Carlson personally led A, B, and F companies up the south face of the mountain. 6 hours of climbing, not walking. Climbing mud near vertical jungle, roots for handholds, men pulling themselves up by vegetation and sliding back and doing it again, sick men in the rain with weapons and ammunition on their backs. 6 hours of it. He was 46 years old and he was at the front of the column. At the crest, they ran into a Japanese patrol. The fight that followed lasted 2 hours at close quarters, in vegetation so dense that a man could not see 10 feet in front of his face. Both sides trying to flank each other in a green blindness, firing at sound, firing at movement. 2 hours of that on top of a mountain, at the end of a month in which nobody had slept properly. 25 Japanese soldiers were killed. 4 raiders were wounded. One of them was First Lieutenant Jack Miller of A Company. He was hit in the face by a burst from a Japanese machine gun. The wound was catastrophic. His lower jaw was very nearly gone. There is no way to describe that injury that is not difficult to hear, and there is no version of it in which a man in that place, in that condition, with the medical supplies the corpsmen had left, which was almost nothing, was going to live. His men carried him down off the mountain anyway. Think about what that meant. A 6-hour climb in the rain, done in reverse, in the dark, carrying a man who could not walk and could not speak, down a slope of mud and roots, by Marines who were themselves feverish and half-starved. They did not leave him. Not for a moment did anyone consider leaving him. Jack Miller died the next morning on the trail. They buried him on the slope of Mount Austin, in the rain and ground that was more water than earth. Standing over that grave was another officer of the battalion, a lieutenant named Victor Magakian, who had been decorated with the Navy Cross for the McKin raid 4 months earlier, a man whose entire reputation in that battalion rested on being unbreakable. He wept. He said afterward that he cried like a baby. He said it was something he had never done in his life. There is a great deal of noise made about what makes men fight, and most of it is wrong. It is not hatred of the enemy which fades. It is not patriotism which is real, but which is too large a thing to hold in your hands at 3 in the morning on a mountain. It is the man next to you. It is a lieutenant named Jack Miller who was alive at breakfast. That is what Magakian was crying about on that slope, and every man who has ever served understands it without needing it explained. The 4th of December, 1942, the final descent toward the Matanakaw River and the American perimeter. 29 days out, the men could smell the sea again. And Carlson's lead element walked into one last Japanese machine gun ambush. 4 raiders were killed. 7 Japanese were killed. 4 men on the last day within sight of friendly lines. Among the 4 was a corporal named Albert Hermiston. There is nothing to say about that, except the plain fact of it. And the plain fact is the thing that will not leave you alone. 4 men survived 29 days of ambush, disease, starvation, and rain, survived Asamana, survived the Metapona, survived the climb up Mount Austin, and were killed on the walk home, with the perimeter in view. War does not have an author. If it did, that would not have happened. Things would balance. Men who had earned an ending would get one. They walked out that afternoon across into the Marine perimeter at Lunga Point. A Marine colonel, seeing the state of them, offered Lieutenant Colonel Carlson a ride to Henderson Field in a jeep. Carlson declined. His men had walked 150 miles. They were going to walk the last stretch, and he was going to walk it with them, and they were going in together. That is the image to hold. Not the kill ratio, not the citation, not the doctrine. A column of scarecrows in rotted uniforms coming out of the tree line on foot, and a 46-year-old lieutenant colonel walking at the head of it because he would not sit down while they stood up. The accounting: 29 days, roughly 150 miles of jungle, something on the order of a dozen separate engagements. 488 Japanese soldiers killed, 16 raiders dead, 17 wounded, 2 75mm mountain guns destroyed, machine guns, small arms, and regimental flags captured. 30-1. Colonel Toshinari Shoji had left Coley Point with somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men of the 230th Infantry Regiment. When what remained of his column finally reached the Japanese 17th Army's positions at the Matanikau, he had between 700 and 800. Disease killed some of them. Starvation killed some of them. Carlson's ambushes killed most of the rest. The 230th Infantry Regiment was finished as a fighting formation on Guadalcanal. And the guns behind Mount Austin, the intelligence Carlson brought back about those trails and those positions and that terrain, fed directly into the operations that took the mountain in the weeks that followed, in December and January, when the American Army units that relieved the Marines went up that same slope. General Vandegrift commended the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion for what he called the consummate skill displayed in the conduct of operations. That was December 1942. Now here is how the United States Marine Corps thanked Evans Carlson. It erased him. Not violently. Not in a way that would ever appear in a headline. In the way institutions always do it quietly, procedurally, through personnel decisions that no one signs their name to in public. The problem was never the results. Nobody disputed the results. The problem was everything else. The gung-ho meetings where a private could stand up and challenge a captain. The officers eating last. The explaining of strategy to riflemen. The Chinese Communist provenance of the whole system, at a moment when that provenance was becoming radioactive. Some senior officers had said openly since 1938 that they thought Carlson was a communist sympathizer. And the fact that his interest in the 8th Route Army had been entirely tactical was a distinction they had never accepted and were not going to start accepting now. When the Raider battalions were reorganized in early 1943, Carlson was moved sideways into a staff position executive officer of the battalion he had created. His replacement immediately reimposed conventional Marine hierarchy. The meetings ended. The separate messes came back. The system that had killed 488 men in 29 days was dismantled by the institution it had been built to serve. By that summer, Carlson was sent home. There is one line from that period worth keeping. It has been attributed to more than one Marine officer over the years, and the attribution has never been nailed down. But it was said, and it circulated, and it was the only verdict that ever mattered. He may be red, but he isn't yellow. Carlson got back into the war one more time. On Saipan in June of 1944, serving as an observer, he went out under enemy fire to pull a wounded radioman to cover. He was shot in the arm and the leg doing it. The wounds ended his career as a field officer. He never recovered fully. He retired in 1946 and was advanced to brigadier general on the retired list for his combat decorations. On the 27th of May, 1947, Evans Fordyce Carlson died of a heart attack. He was 51 years old. 51. 2 years older than the war he had spent his life warning people about. The China tours, the Nicaragua patrol, Maaken, the long patrol, Saipan, all of it packed into a life that ended before most men's careers do. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The Marine Corps made no public announcement of the funeral. General Vandegrift, by then commandant, attended anyway. There is a story attached to that graveside passed down by a Marine who had served with Carlson in China, who said he overheard Vandegrift say something as he walked away from the grave. It has been repeated for decades, and it is bitter enough that it has become part of the legend. It cannot be confirmed. It rests on a single second-hand account, and there is no documentary support for it. And it should be treated as what it is, a story that men told, not a fact that was recorded. It is included here only because you will encounter it elsewhere, and you should know its weight. What can be confirmed is this. The three-man fire team that Evans Carlson built in 1942, 1 Garand, 1 Thompson, 1 Browning automatic rifle, 3 teams to a squad, was adopted across the entire United States Marine Corps. It is still there. Every Marine rifle squad on this planet today, right now, is built on 3 fire teams, the structure that a man the Corps, Distrusted, invented on the basis of what he watched Chinese guerrillas do in Shanxi province in 1938. It survived Korea. It survived Vietnam. It survived every doctrinal revolution of the last 80 years. Iwo Jima was taken by squads organized on Carlson's model. So was the Chosin breakout. So was Hue City. So was Fallujah. The meetings were abolished. The man was pushed aside. The battalions were disbanded in early 1944, and the word Raider went out of the Marine Corps vocabulary for 71 years. The Marine Corps stood up a Special Operations Command in 2006. For most of a decade, it had no name that meant anything. And then, in 2015, it decided what to call the men in it. Out of the entire history of the Corps, out of Below Wood and Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima and Chosin, out of every unit and every legend it owns it, reached back and picked one name. Marine Raiders. Carlson's name, Carlson's word, chosen and carried forward by the institution that had spent 1,943 quietly removing him from it. There is a lesson in that, and it is not a comfortable one, and it is probably worth saying plainly. Institutions do not forgive people who are right in the wrong way. They cannot. An institution runs on its own conventions, and a man who proves those conventions unnecessary is a threat to it, whatever his results. And the institution will find a way to move him aside, and it will do it with paperwork rather than malice. But institutions also cannot help keeping what works. They will bury the man and adopt his method. They will strike his name from the roster and build the next 80 years on his idea. And eventually, long after everyone with a grievance is dead, they will put his word on a beret and hand it to a 19-year-old who has never heard of him. 16 men are still on Guadalcanal in the ground where their friends put them. A private named Owen Barber in a kunai grass field near the Metapona. A first lieutenant named Jack Miller on the south slope of Mount Austin, buried in the rain by men who had carried him 6 hours down a mountain rather than leave him. A corporal named Albert Hermiston, killed on the last day within sight of the lines. And 12 more. They were not extraordinary men when they enlisted. They were store clerks and farm hands and mechanics from towns you have driven through. What was extraordinary was what they were asked to do, and that they did it, and that most of them never talked about it much afterward to anyone who had not been there. 29 days, 150 miles, 488 to 16. The Japanese army went looking for a marine patrol in the jungles of Guadalcanal in November of 1942. They found it. That was the mistake.